Good morning, everyone. My name is Jim Rollo. I'm Assistant Director of, or rather Deputy Director of the UK Trade Policy Observatory, and also an Associate Research Fellow of Chatham House. And I'm your chair for the morning. We've got quite a distinguished, or a very distinguished group of people here to talk about something which we've all been talking about since the referendum, but I'm not sure the level of understanding has increased enormously over that time on the subject. So we're going to talk about some research that was commissioned and funded by the BCC, and I'll introduce characters as they come up, but we'll start with a few words from the director of the UK Trade Policy Observatory, Alan Winters, who's sitting away modestly in the corner there. But Alan, do you want to start? And then we'll move forward from there.
Not a big speech, just a word of welcome. There are one or two new faces. We're always pleased to see new people, quite a number of old friends to UKTPO. UKTPO was formed 18 months ago to try and analyse trade policy for the UK following Brexit. We've been working away at it. One of the things that we've been saying for 18 months is trade policy is very gritty. It depends on a lot of detail. It depends on a lot of expertise. And it's very fine and very useful to have grand models that say the cost will be 4.7% of GDP, but the real work gets done at a much lower level. So we've been delighted to be able to cooperate with the British Chambers of Commerce on some of the practicalities, one of many practicalities that in fact we're going to have to resolve in the near future. So let me say welcome. We have an expert panel of discussants and authors, and I'm sure you'll find it a very useful morning. So welcome and thank you.
Okay. Thanks very much, Alan, for that. We're going to move on, I think, quite smartly to the presentation of the main results of the research project, and that's going to be introduced by Peter Holmes, and then we will have Nick Jacob, and then again Peter at the end. And I'll try and keep them moving so that we don't fall too far behind. All right, Peter, on you go.
Well, thank you very much indeed for coming. Let me just say this study was done, supported by BCC, and I'm really grateful. I'm just the sort of impresario here. The real work was done by Nick here, and the power behind the throne was Anastasia, who kept saying, I think that comma should be moved very slightly to the left there. And she's been fantastic. And they're the people who really know the stuff. So just to introduce the basic point, when the UK leaves the EU, and of course we're not quite sure what date we're talking about. Will there be a no-change transition period? So at the end of this period, we will be outside the customs union and outside the common commercial policy. And that means that even if we have a comprehensive free trade agreement with the EU, everything is going to have to be, origin is going to have to be proved to show the eligibility of British goods for any free trade agreement. And in fact, if we look at the EU-Turkey arrangements, even if there was a customs union with a very small number of exceptions in, there would have to be origin demonstrated at the border or through some other mechanism to show that goods were not in the exception category. This doesn't, an origin, of course, as everybody knows here, doesn't just mean where it last came out the factory, but where all the parts and components where enough of the parts and components were based. Now, there's a lot of discussion about origin, but most of it's been at a rather higher level about the impact of rules of origin on trade flows, what there's been very little discussion and analysis of is the mechanisms by which origin has to be demonstrated at borders. And that's what this study's been about. In particular, how the certificate of origin system works, which is managed by the Chambers of Commerce. But there are other systems, the approved exporter scheme and the REC system, which the EU operates. And what we don't know is what will be in any final settlement. I mean, one would say what will be negotiated, it may be that what maybe the EU will unilaterally decide it. We just don't know. And that's the sort of thing which I know the folks in DIT are particularly concerned about. And just to sort of say how the study was done, we are focusing on the question of certification of origin. There are many other reasons why origin needs to be established at the borders, including issues of whether the anti-dumping duties are needed, statistical purposes, security purposes, there may be health and safety regulatory purposes which require origin proof, and there are all sorts of commercial reasons which Nick will mention where the origin certification is important. Basically, the study was done on the basis of three sources. A literature survey. There's been quite a lot of sort of economic studies of the impact of different rules of origin, but very little on how the different methods operate for demonstrating it. We then did a series, or Nick did a series of case studies, quite intensive telephone interviews with Anastasia's support here to establish the background, how this thing worked in detail. And then the last annual BCC survey of members had a special section on rules of origin. Now, of course, we have to admit that the survey and the case studies were not represented. We didn't actually. I don't think technically we could have made them representative. We don't know what the characteristics are that you'd need to make a representative sample. But Nick will tell you all the details now, who's done all the hard work.
Okay, thank you, Peter. Okay, so we started with a literature review where there isn't a lot out there on the mechanics of proving origin, which is what we really wanted to get at. But there is quite a literature on the overall cost of rules of origin, which provided some insights for us to start with. Now, what this literature kind of says is rules of origin can act as serious non-tariff barriers to trade. And older studies based on trade data over sort of since the late 90s, we're coming up with estimates of sort of 3 to 8% of a shipment's value as the cost of the rules. Now, that's a really significant barrier to trade. And part of that is to do with the administrative burden that firms face. Now, newer estimates with more detailed data are lower, and you can get down to costs of some of these estimates are down to sort of $14 for a transaction. So, you know, you go from a serious barrier to trade to a minor inconvenience for firms. We wanted to understand a little bit more about that. One thing that the literature does seem to suggest, though, is that small firms disproportionately bear the burden because fixed costs are most important in this rather than variable costs, and therefore they're spreading this cost over a smaller shipment size, and that leads to more burden on smaller firms. However, again, limited direct evidence on the costs and the different costs and benefits of alternative regimes that people may use. But you know, some insights there that we can use to inform the study. Now, Peter mentioned that we don't have a representative sample. What we wanted to do, though, was to speak to some firms on the ground using the current system as it is and try and understand from them why they're using a particular way of declaring origin, what the costs to them are, and what they see as some of the other benefits. You know, what is their experience? Now, the thing that was repeated to us that really came through from those interviews was that firms aren't being strategic with their use of ways of declaring origin or receiving preferences from importing countries. Very much it's, if the importing country customer says you've got to have this piece of paper, the firms will go and get the piece of paper. So even where preferences are available, i.e. they could charge a lower price, or the importer would pay a lower price post-tariff, firms won't go and get that piece of paper unless they're specifically asked for it, which is kind of it's an interesting, there's money left on the table. Is this due to the complexity? Is this due to the cost? Why would this be the case? The second thing that came out is firms didn't really consider the certification process as being a major cost in terms of time or money. So the 20 to 40 pounds or whatever it costs to get a certificate, and the 30 minutes of time it may take to get the certificate. No one felt it was particularly onerous in that respect. A lot of the supplier documentation that they need to keep comes from other aspects of their trade, so whether it's enterprise resource planning, whether it's some other part of their supply chain management, whether it's for a warranty, whether it's a regulatory demand for registration of a product in a foreign market, or testing, or whatever it is. They're getting that documentation in a lot of cases for other reasons than origin. So it's not seen as a big burden. Now, the caveat to that is that some of the people we spoke to were called approved exporters. For those of you who don't know what an approved exporter is, it's a EU-wide scheme run in the UK by the HMRC that allows firms to be pre-approved for a particular type of goods that they export, and allows them to declare origin on their invoice. Now, those that use that system, who are exporting regularly, clearly like the savings of that 30 minutes of time every time they do it, and find it very efficient. So, if they had to move to the certification side, they may find it more onerous. But even so. Now, the other point that we did find here as well that I think is interesting is that when we pushed firms, and albeit this was a small number, and we may not have been talking to the person who knew exactly what the rules were, but firms didn't always seem to understand fully the rule of origin they faced, or how the system fully worked. And we wanted to understand that a little bit more in the survey, and see if that was a general problem with firms. Do they really understand what's happening here? Especially given that this system is probably going to expand when people need certificates or some form of proving origin with trade with the EU. Okay, so our online survey, this is part of the annual Chambers International Trade Survey. We got 4 questions or so. So there were about 1,600 respondents overall to the survey, of which 679 were useful to us as exporters to non-EU countries, and therefore possibly getting preferences. Small firms, less than 50 UK employees, made up like 3/4 of the sample, which is a lot, and probably the area we're most interested in. These are the guys that, if anyone's going to struggle, are going to struggle most. And I've summarised the questions there. We wanted to know, do people use preferential and non-preferential certificates of origin? We wanted to explain why they did. We gave them as many options as we could for both preferential and non-preferential. And finally, we really wanted to know about those who don't use certificates of origin, where they could. Why would that be? Why are they not taking advantage of preferences if they're there? Where is that? Now, the results, we don't have time to go through all of them, but the highlights for me, I think, the smallest firms are those least likely to say they use any type of certificate of origin. I think we're kind of establishing through the literature that we already have, through the interviews we did, and through this, that small firms are kind of being left out of this system to a certain extent, probably because they don't understand it. But customer requirements are the key reason for all firms as to why they do use it. Again, it's being something that is being pushed on them that they need to have, and they're not seeing other benefits from it. One of our final graphs here as well, I think, illustrates quite nicely. So among the subsamples, so I mean, this is like 108 firms out of those 600 or so that aren't using certificates of origin. Why not? Well, it's not to do with the difficulty and cost of complying with the rules. So whether it's they can't trace the inputs they're using, so they don't know whether they're meeting the rule or not, and it's not because the rules are too complex for them to understand. Or it's not because it might be because the rules are too complex. It's not because they can't source their own inputs from originating suppliers. What is a problem is a lack of understanding. And so, we think it's important that small firms are kind of given the support they need to navigate the system, particularly if we're going to expand it to another half of our trade. Okay. Peter.
Okay. Well, just finally, I think it's very difficult to actually come up with definitive conclusions, but I think the one which does emerge is that the problem with rules of origin, proof of rules of origin, is not that it's expensive to do so. It's that for certain firms, it's tricky to know what they're doing. And I think there's some of the BCC experts here have actually done some work on what happens when a firm gets it wrong. So we may actually pick your brains on this.
Do you want me to say something?
Well, maybe you could join in the general. It's called Jim will shut me up. But I mean, if you fill in the wrong documentation, there are penalties, and that can be quite complicated. But firms don't always know what the rules are. One of the answers that came up in Nick's survey is, well, of course we know these things have got UK origin. We bought the components locally. That must give them British origin, mustn't it? And people are going to have quite a lot of training how to do this. And of course, it's going to be much more complicated after Brexit, because even on the most favourable terms, the firms are now going to have to distinguish between UK origin and EU origin, and there may be new lots of different customs FTAs with different arrangements. So it's going to become extremely complicated. And, it is only one part of the picture, the VAT documentation and so on. So all firms, and the message simply is all firms are going to have to get used to a much more complicated regime. More are going to have to operate the existing regime, and the existing regime itself is going to get more complicated. And someone is going to have to help them out, I think. So that's me. Thank you.
Okay, thanks very much, Peter. I think your last point is one that I think people ought to perhaps reflect on, because this is not going to be the only game in town where there's an intensification of customs procedures. And the other thing that strikes me about what's said here is, that there's a real question in this about what happens on the other side of the border. It's not a question of what we do. It's a question of what overseas customs do and how they tackle these issues. And rules of origin is only going to be one aspect of that, is just worth keeping in mind in it all. Sorry, I knew I wouldn't shut up finally on these things. I'm very pleased to hand over now to two of our collaborators from BCC. First of all, Adam Marshall, the Director General, and followed by Anastasia Belyakova, who's Head of Trade. So, Adam, over to you.
Jim, many thanks. I will stand up. It makes very little difference to my height, everybody, but I'll do it anyway, just so that those at the back can see me. First of all, I just want to express my thanks to both Peter and Nick for their work on this report. Peter's right. So much of the existing discussion about future trade relationships, both with the EU and around the world, has focused on things like tariffs and hasn't focused on the mechanics of how we move goods across borders. And we wanted to shed a little bit of light on that in this collaboration and actually emphasize the fact that for so many firms who are exporting around the world, there are some tried and trusted systems in place that help them to do that effectively, efficiently, and cheaply. I think there are really three big issues that we hear from most of our businesses when it comes to why they need a good system in place for managing their goods across borders and for declaring origin. The first and most important is faster clearance. Because these are rules determined by customs authorities elsewhere rather than anything that we do here, the business's top priority is usually getting their goods through and to the final destination, to the customer, as quickly as possible. They don't have room or time for uncertainty, and they don't have room for the impact on their margins. So that is a really important motivator for those who are in the know, and there are many, as our colleague said, who are not in the know, but those who are in the know, that is one of their main motivations. Of course, the second then is claiming preferences, taking those lower tariff rates where they are available. Our colleagues around the Chamber network suggest that businesses are actually quite good, particularly when they get a more sophisticated knowledge, at taking up the preferences that are open to them. And we want to make sure that they do that because, of course, it makes British companies more competitive in their exports around the world. And the third reason, often overlooked, I think, but mentioned by colleagues in this report, is that very often getting a document proving origin is part of a commercial transaction process, again designed entirely separately to government rules in this country, again designed perhaps by those who are involved in that transaction, whether it be for a letter of credit or any other requirement. And that means that firms are going to go after this sort of proof regardless of whether governments require it, as long as there is a commercial requirement for them to do so. It is important to say, we have been talking today about certificates, and everyone is immediately thinking about A4 sheets of paper. The vast majority of the documentation that's done is, of course, done online. It is originated online, but then at the other end, it is spat out, whether in electronic or in paper form, to meet the requirements of the destination, the customs authority in the destination. So for anyone who thinks that there are just people bevying around with wet stamps and quill pens, that's very much not the case. We have a modern documentation system which has had significant investment in the last decade in order to make electronic means of input as good as possible. But also, I think we cannot discount the importance of having, as we do, 57 front doors in every part of the UK, so that a business can sort out a requirement face-to-face if it does need to do so. So they can go in, get the requirement sorted out, they can do it online. There are many options open to them, and it's responsive to the market. Sense of numbers. Last year, Chambers of Commerce helped to assure 650,000 shipments or thereabouts across borders around the world. The value of the goods for which those origin documents was provided was in the region of £22 billion. So it is a very significant chunk of cross-border trade and British export which is being assured in this way. I mentioned those 57 front doors. There are 300 people around the country whose job it is to help companies with these questions and who've gained real expertise and real knowledge of the processes to help smooth the way. So there is an infrastructure in place. That infrastructure is also international. Peter Bishop is here today in the room. Peter works with us on the International Chambers of Commerce and the World Chambers Federation, where our colleagues in national chambers around the world also build up this service. So that all around the world, chambers of commerce are seen as a trusted third party to help get goods across borders and to their final destination. So whilst the technical issues around origin are very, very important for businesses, they are a steep learning curve for many of our firms, what we do know is that finding a simple and easy way to comply with them saves businesses time, saves them money, saves them stress. There's a good commercial reason for doing this stuff. When we have FTAs in the future, we want to make sure that this kind of mechanism could be used alongside trusted trader and approved exporter schemes, so exporters can use what they're comfortable with. And we want them to be able to take up preferences when we do negotiate those new agreements in future. And we know that this is a route that enables them to do that. Final point from me, there is an education job to do, as the research makes very, very clear. But when you have that infrastructure of 300 people on the ground, when you have the systems in place, which businesses will often have used when they have gone to non-EU destinations and taken their goods to non-EU destinations, we have a starting point. And I think Chambers of Commerce across the UK will look forward to working with businesses to improve their knowledge on this in the years to come. If I can pass over to my colleague, Anastasia.
Thank you, Adam. Yes, if I can first start by saying a very big thank you to Peter and Nick for all your hard work and your patience with me. And also thank you very much to all the Chamber colleagues, both in the UK and internationally, and all the businesses who took the time to take part in this. I think it's really important that we did this research because so much of the conversation on trade focuses on the theory, which is important, but ultimately it's businesses who trade. So it's really critical to understand what are the actual barriers, where do they need help, and how do they see it. 2 points that I wanted to add to what's already been said. One is a misconception that bothers me slightly. Customs declarations are not the same thing as origin declaration. Now, when we talk about Brexit, we often talk about, oh, the new documentation requirements. These customs declarations per shipment and the means of proving origin are two separate things. The first, customs, has of course been covered quite extensively over the last few months. We know there's going to be a new system in place, CDS. We don't yet know how companies will be able to integrate into it, but we've been assured that it will work well. However, what the whole discussion on CDS has raised is that there is a bit of apprehension about new systems, and that in light of all of these definite changes coming ahead, there definitely will be customs declarations between the UK and the EU, for instance. It's really important for companies that we can maintain continuity in some of the other systems in place. Now, how do we actually ensure this continuity? Well, it requires a lot of work, and it requires negotiation. This is one aspect on which the UK cannot stay complacent, because if it does, it might have to accept systems or options that might be more beneficial for another party, but are perhaps not so easy for UK companies to use. In the world, there's about 450 preferential trade agreements. So that means that there's a lot of complexity with rules of origin, and there's also many different means of proving origin. And what we've heard from speaking to colleagues involved in trade negotiations worldwide is that often these means of compliance are overlooked in the negotiations. So you spent all the hard work negotiating the tariff rates, the quotas, you think, excellent, I got the best deal for my businesses. And then when it comes to the actual origin declaration, one party will come with, crudely, their copy-pasted trade agreement, you come with your copy-pasted trade agreement, it mixes together. It seems like you've reached a compromise, but actually there might be some challenges here and there which mean that it's complicated then for businesses to comply. And not only is it complicated for businesses to comply in this situation, but it also means that the importer at the other end doesn't get the preferential rate that they want. You have to remember that customs authorities collect revenue. Some customs authorities in other countries might not be incentivized to actually grant the preferential rate. So unless there is a system that is internationally recognized, that is compliant with the World Customs Organization, that is compliant with the Kyoto Protocol on best practice in customs, as certificates of origin are, and unless there is a third party, which chambers of commerce around the world act as, to be the independent arbiter of this is the right way of doing origin declaration, we can vouch for this having been completed correctly, it is easier for a customs authority at the other end to reject this origin declaration, and then potentially for the business to not get the deal that they wanted to get. So it's really important to actively negotiate this in trade agreements. It's really important to be proactive in setting out your means of customs compliance. In the meantime, chambers are, of course, here to help businesses navigate this. We are here to also advise government on how this is done in best practice terms internationally. So my final message is there's a lot of complexity, there's a lot of change ahead. We know there'll be customs declarations, new arrangements for VAT, many other means of complying with new trading arrangements with the EU that businesses need to adapt to. But as we set out on this new course, both with the EU and potentially with new trading partners, let's keep this in place and let's help businesses navigate this. So, thank you.
Thanks very much, Anastasia. I think quite a range of issues revealed by both the research directly and the implications of that on a wider set of issues around customs procedures.
What about following up on the point about what if people file declarations with errors in?
Neil, do you want to say a bit about that issue, and then and say who you are. Sorry, say who you are.
Sorry, Liam Smith. I work with Anastasia and Adam at the BCC. Actually, I feel that they're on the panel and they know this stuff that I know as well. So it feels a bit wrong to do it. But I think some of the issues that companies face when they get things wrong, Adam already alluded to the whole reason for requiring certificates of origin are pretty widespread. I mean, it can be just because they need to get their goods across the border and they're applying for preference, or because a third country customs agency requires it of them, in particular in GCC countries, for example, it would be a requirement. When they get it wrong, what happens is they get delays. Or the delay in getting the goods to market is because they require a certificate, for example, for a letter of credit, and so they have delays at the bank facilitating the letter of credit, and so the whole thing is about building some assurance around the trade that they have. And when companies get it wrong before they make the trade, that's to say they've agreed a contract to supply something, they haven't taken into account the implications of requiring certificates of origin or requiring letters of credit and so on, then it erodes margin, because time erodes margins, time costs money. So being prepared and having a deep understanding of why certificates might be needed is a job we all have to do. I think the evidence in your research shows that companies oftentimes don't know why it is they even have applied for a CO. It's because a customer requires it rather than because a seller thinks it's a good idea. And
if they get it wrong, they can be pursued by the HMRC?
Well, they can be. I think what you're alluding to is a conversation I talked about where the number of preference certificates that are rejected by foreign governments is around 300 to 500 per annum, and about 40% of those are proved to be preference certificates that ought not to have been issued. Now, the implication, therefore, is actually not on the seller, although the seller would be put right by HMRC here that they applied in a wrong basis. It's actually the importer that would then be subject to those duties. So you either will lose a customer or have your buyer sending you a bill for duties that you said that they wouldn't have to pay and now they have to. So of course it affects trade, but there's not a high volume of those each year, but nonetheless there are some, and they could be critical to the business that people are doing.
Adam.
Yeah, just to point on that, Liam, you said 300 to 500 preference documents rejected by an overseas customs authority per year. How many are issued in total per year? Do you know?
We think about 120,000 or thereabouts.
120,000, so 300 to 500 out of 120,000 shipments affected by that.
Yeah, that's the number that are rejected. Of course, only about 40% actually are found to be, in fact, wrongly issued. I should say that Chambers of Commerce don't issue hardly any of those, one or two perhaps in any given year. So we're more likely to get it right than get it wrong.
So it's a real insurance policy then?
It is an insurance policy, yeah.
Okay, right, David. just say who you are and where you're from.
David Henning, Department for International Trade. Given what we're saying about utilisation of preferences, or perhaps about companies not realising what they can benefit from, what can government do to make sure that post March 2019 we provide as much information as possible to companies about what about existing trade agreements, about what mechanisms can be used, etc.
Yeah. So, excellent question, and I think perhaps I can throw in on the edge of that the whole question what we do about small firms in this context. It seems to me the 76%, okay, three quarters of the sample were small firms in this, and that points to a real issue of information management that seems to, and because we might have other reasons for wanting to favour or at least to encourage small firms rather more than they're encouraged now, because exporting is largely seen as a big firm activity from in a statistical basis, I think, as much as anything. So any thoughts on that from the panel, I think, would be helpful. So what can government do to help in this context, and where do we go with small firms in particular? Who wants to kick off? Nick's chaining at the bit.
Well, I'm only going to say very obvious things, but being able to find the information you need as a business to export to country X, product Y, and have a complete list of the things you need to do and what qualifies and what doesn't would be super helpful. Now, at the moment, one goes to the EC website to find out what the rule of origin is and therefore what you need to do to export. Clearly, the UK will need its own website that lists tariffs by product and country. But there are probably things you can do on top to make it even clearer, to put the information where people will see it. But
and to add to that, having people to speak to and knowing who you can speak to. We were just discussing this earlier, that companies very often will just send something assuming that they don't need to have any documentation alongside it, that there's that they will just pass through customs without an issue. That may be the case currently for sending goods to the EU, but that's certainly not the case for trade with the rest of the world, and different countries have different requirements, and you really need to know that there is a pool of experts somewhere who will be able to guide you, who mean that it's not going to then be you stuck with your goods stuck at the border and then trying to rectify the situation. So really, that's something that we're reiterating again and again, having not just a database somewhere online, but also face-to-face support available, particularly for smaller companies who might not have the expertise in-house, is absolutely critical.
I just add to that, David. I think that what the government, to answer what the government can do specifically, it is to adopt a no wrong door approach to information and advice. A lot of businesses who, particularly the small ones that Jim is referring to, government wouldn't be their first port of call in order to try to get the information that they need in order to complete their commercial transaction. And if from the demand side, actually, what people want is something that is more local, that is more close to home, or that is from the private sector, you would then think, okay, partners are going to be very important in this endeavour. And I think that partnership between the government and chambers, probably other organisations as well, is going to be hugely important in that education effort. So having materials as well that can be white labelled, this is the official government position, but it's got the wrapper of a business organisation or a trade association on it, may give some of those businesses the confidence that they require. Doing things together with government actually can work really, really well in this space. You just have to overcome the fact that some businesses are reticent to approach government at first go.
And just another quick point, we certainly are already being asked by our members, well, more broadly, what should we do in preparation for Brexit? And also more specifically, what can we expect in terms of origin declaration requirements in the future, not just with the EU, but also will there be continuity in the existing trade agreements? And then finally, also later on with other negotiations. So there is already demand for knowledge in this area. So I think there is definitely some time pressure from the business perspective to understand what they need to comply with.
So I think in terms of information, it'd probably be important to distinguish between those firms that are already exporting will need a bit of information on how things are modified. I mean, if you suddenly got to use the REC system rather than certificates of origin, or use it if you have a choice, how do you do that? And then there'll be firms who've got no exposure whatsoever to certificates of origin. They'll need to have information on starting from the base. And the second thing I would say from the government's point of view is that, as Anastasia was stressing, this is something that needs to be taken very seriously very early on in the negotiation process, because it's not a unilateral, as Anastasia, it's a thing that we decide we will support certificates of origin rather than another system. This is going to have to be negotiated, and people's opinions will need to be taken into account. There may not be negotiation, but...
And the EU has formed, doesn't it, in pushing towards one type of outcome or one type of mechanism. But if we are going to be in favour of free trade and as much trade as possible, you create as many mechanisms to satisfy that market requirement as possible. So you could have the approved exporter route, you could have the certificates route sitting alongside it just fine. You don't have to necessarily have one or the other, you need to negotiate to have both.
But that's about what we want to do on our imports. The question is what we do about exports.
Well, that is the export.
That is the export.
Sorry. Because, well, it seems to me that the exports rules of origin are in the hands of your partner.
Demonstration purpose.
In this context. And coming to the negotiation about those, I remember the first time I really came across rules of origin, it was on the Europe agreements with the EU and Poland and various other countries. And the actual negotiating brief, so to speak, for the EU was about 70% rules of origin. And typically when the US turns up to negotiate with you, they slap down their standard agreement and it's that big, and more or less all of it is rules of origin in this context. So this is an extraordinarily complex area to deal with. We probably need to deal with the 65 countries that we're trying to grandfather with very early in this process, so there's information for exporters about what to do about rules of origin, what's the range of options for them, and so on. So I think this is quite a complicated information system.
Yep, absolutely. And you mentioned the US. One interesting thing about their requirements for origin declaration is that they often prefer declaration of origin on an invoice. But then what you don't have there is a trusted third party. So why we keep emphasizing this is because there is no one later to say that the US Customs Authority has acted incorrectly in denying a preferential origin to a company. There is absolutely no need for them to justify themselves, and then this means that the company doesn't have this insurance that we were talking about. So really it's about protecting the market access for your companies going into another market.
Yeah. Okay, the two questions there, one just behind and then Val. Now remind us who you are and
Joe
where you're
Edgerton.
from.
I used to be Economics Director at the British Chambers of Commerce. I joined in 77, left in 82, and I then did quite a lot of work going on up to 92 for various chambers. So I saw the opposite process, in a sense. And first thing I'd say is the best thing the government can do in terms of dealing, particularly with small and medium firms, is get out of the way entirely. Back in those days when we were going into what was then Common Market, European EEC, the government did get out of the way. The ABCC appointed as president a former minister from the Department of Trade, Pat Limerick, and it recruited a senior civil servant as Director General, and there were excellent relations with what was then the Department of Trade, and the division line was quite straightforward. They deal with policy, they talk to the chambers, and through the ABCC and then through the regional groups of chambers, information was regularly disseminated, but the chambers were left to sort out the documentation and were left with the interface, particularly with the small and medium-sized firms. And that meant that you'd actually got people, you would actually, if you were Birmingham or Liverpool or wherever, or Dover, you could go around and see somebody and get help. Of course, this was mostly before computerization. And I just think that that is the only sane and sensible way for this to operate, and I think it's probably our best bet as well for getting the big German and French and other chambers of commerce, which have a great deal of power, backing us as well, so we get something more sensible. I can remember particularly people like the director of Dusseldorf Chamber being incredibly helpful in terms of sorting things out, because he would regularly, if we had difficulties, he would regularly get on the phone to what was then his BOM for us, and it worked. So I just emphasize that I think it's got to be that. The other thing I'd say is please don't underestimate the problems you're going to get if you start making forms and other things, even though electronically ordered, organized and inputted, more complex. I happen to now do most of my living in the city in compliance areas. I can tell you particularly some of the small and medium-sized firms are having huge difficulties because MiFID II has caused alterations and significant changes and expansion of some of the electronic reporting systems, and they're getting all their returns bounced back and everything else. These things look easy. Everyone said the prototype testing with the big firms all worked beautifully, and it's not working very well. And we are going to have very big dislocation, much bigger than people anticipate, as a result of people not being able to manage the IT systems as effectively as you'd hoped. And that's going to be, again, a big area where I would say if you went to the chambers, you'd at least have a prospect of sorting it out.
Thanks. Just pass the microphone forward.
Hi. Hi, Balkinder, DIT. So I have kind of two brief questions. One relates to the impact on small businesses. You kind of said, Nick, how the impact can disproportionately affect small businesses. So my understanding isn't kind of 100% on this, but I understand that for businesses exporting a shipment worth less than €6,000, there are exemptions or the requirements on them are somewhat lower. Do you see any merits in increasing that threshold to help businesses that are exporting lower values of goods as a way to kind of balance the impacts? And then my second question was around, did any of the businesses in your survey mention anything around the compliance cost associated with supply chains? So we've spoken a lot about the administrative burden, but I wonder if you picked up anything on, because rules may have changed, are firms now having to kind of reallocate their supply chains and where they're getting materials from?
Okay, so on the first question, the low value exemption or low value invoice declaration. So if you're the same, it's part of the rules that, if you go to New York and you buy a computer, you can bring it back if it's under £500. Well, if you're shipping goods, there's this €6,000 limit. It's not €6,000 for all. There's a few trade agreements where it's slightly different. We haven't looked, and I'm not sure there's any research on how those differences in limits affect people differently. I think it would certainly seem to be from our survey that small firms tended to use that limit more, clearly. But where there is a cost of rules of origin, where they're having to get certificates and spend time and get their supply declarations in place and all of this sort of thing, then that cost is spread over a small amount. It's more than €6,000, but it's spread over a smaller shipment than a multinational will be making. So I think one could possibly look at that, but we don't have any evidence for how that would affect people. On the second point, how do supply chains, or how do firms deal with rules in the supply chains? We didn't pick much up. Okay, it was something we wanted to talk to people about. There was actually one firm, for instance, that one of their big inputs into their production process could come from China, or it could come from somewhere in the CE, Hungary, I think. And that had a determination on whether they could claim preference or not. For the rest, it seemed more like, okay, they were, they had their supplies, they had their product. There wasn't a lot going on in terms of deciding whether to source it from somewhere or somewhere else. And the one question we asked about why firms don't use certificates, seemed to show that it wasn't about I can't source my components from an originating supplier or I can't trace them. That wasn't an issue for firms. It was just I don't really understand this. I'm not going to bother with it. So although in the literature you may find that people are very worried about firms using sort of non-least cost suppliers because of preferences somewhere else, this doesn't seem to be something when we talk to a handful of firms.
Could I just throw one thing in? I was at a meeting with consultants who advise motor industry component suppliers, and they're from all over the world. I said, how many people here have actually thought about the implications of rules of origin? And some of them were in North America, some in Europe, and only one of the 20 or 30 people in the room actually had thought about this. I mean, that was someone in working in the southern United States, worried about the rules of origin issues in NAFTA. So one has the impression that until they actually change, people are not spending their time, thinking, shall I switch sources and so on.
I think that, you have to separate out, I think, knowledge from administrative burden. I think government too often in doing analyses on these issues conflates the two. The problem that you're demonstrating with that example is knowledge. Compliance, once you have the knowledge, and dealing with the admin is very simple and very straightforward, particularly once companies get used to doing it. It just becomes part of their normal processes. So, given that the requirement is coming from an external customs organization or from a commercial transaction, actually, doing the compliance work really isn't the problem. The problem is having the knowledge base to start with. That's where the real gap is. I think on the exemptions question as well, surely any change to that number is subject to negotiations with the destination country. And for better or for worse, at the moment when I talk to my counterparts elsewhere, there are worries in other national customs authorities if the UK came in and suddenly said they wanted to raise the exemption levels a lot, because at least in Europe, the UK is seen already as a country where things slip past customs and then into free circulation in the European market from markets with lower prices and perhaps not always on the best terms. So I think we have to be very, very careful about that. We have got a good reputation amongst most of the world in terms of what our exporters do, and in trying to change exemptions we might affect that in some way. So it's a very careful balance that has to be struck, I think.
So yeah.
Thank you. James Monk from Business West. So we're a chamber down in the southwest of England and also have the pleasure of delivering the DIT regional contract as well. And I think Adam's point of compliance and knowledge is so relevant. Where the chamber adds value so often is a client will come to us thinking they need some documentation, which because of the de minimis value, they actually won't. But we then start a dialogue with them. So rather than just saying, no, you don't need it, most of these small exporters, and they're the lifeblood of this country, they are not exporters, they are manufacturers who are doing international trade. It's not their core competency. They're just trying to get a box from Birmingham to Mumbai. That's their knowledge of it. Now, we think, and a lot of our big companies are, incredibly erudite and are optimizing everything and getting their tariff relief. Most of these small businesses aren't. They're taking their standard transaction spot rate their bank's giving them. When we start talking to them, we used the term earlier, there's money left on the table. By heck, there's an awful lot of money left on the table, and that more than outweighs the £20 worth of certificate of origin charge you get put across. That's where the real value is, and that's engaging with those companies then and going, actually, you are exporting, how do we now help you to do more of it? And I think the earlier point of what should DIT be doing once we know what's happening, no, it's what we should be doing now. We should be communicating to companies that, no, we don't know what the future's going to bring, but it will turn up, and we will make sure that you can still export, and we will guide you through whatever bureaucracy is out there. We'll try and keep it as a minimum, but it won't just be going to a website and finding an FAQ and trying to diagnose this themselves. That's what terrifies the SMEs out there. They trust us. We need to build on that trust and work with them to go, look, keep on trading. Don't stop.
Okay. Or I don't know if anyone wants to comment on any of that.
There is, that last point, James, I think is really, really important. When businesses turn to Dr. Google to answer a problem, they usually make the symptoms worse, don't they? Whereas if they actually get an expert opinion, they tend to be better. And I think that is so hugely important.
Okay. More questions at this point? I just wonder for Peter and Nick what they think, what they draw on this for future work in this sort of area. It's not an area that economists have often got their hands dirty on. We economists, by and large, try and simplify rather than complexify. It may not seem like that from outside the profession, but that's what they're trying to do. But whether there are some things from that, from what we've learned from this one, for the next stage, and perhaps about a more generalised treatment of the burdens of customs procedures, particularly on small firms, that we can look to try and ameliorate, or at least to look for routes to do that.
Well, I think, as Anastasia said, proving origin is one relatively small part of the administrative burden of exporting or doing international trade. You mentioned a whole bunch of other stuff there that, in terms of customs declarations, that firms have to go through. It would be interesting, I think, to understand, how those costs are related to each other, which ones are the most burden, and on who. Put it in a little bit more context.
Yes, I mean, I think I'd emphasise that, and then there's just the question that Bal raised about how far will supply chains find themselves under pressure to shift if either the difficulty of demonstrating origin or the actual substantive rules change, and so. It's the thing which we've been banging on about, the question of third countries. I mean, what happens if we're exporting to third countries using EU components? I mean, it was a quite interesting piece came out from the American government. Someone put on Twitter. I'm sure David's seen this. But what the actual breakdown of the origin of cars imported to the United States is, and it goes down model by model. And exactly, how much the origin from the country which is nominally the exporter is, how much it goes to all the other countries, and where the engine comes from. And clearly people are going to be having to think quite carefully about these things, and it's going to depend on what the famous trilateral connections are. I mean, are we going to be able to export stuff to our existing free trade area partners without penalty with EU components? And so it's the complications of the actual rules, and then the second order thing is going to be how supply chains might actually change.
I can only echo that, and of course UKTPO has done some excellent work in this area on accumulation and really what the options are for our existing trade agreements. From a business perspective, companies are alive to this issue, but only very few are actively preparing for this. I think it's really only the case of very big companies, perhaps they're car manufacturers indeed, who are starting to ask their supply chain to really identify the origin and then trying to think through, would they have to then do onshoring, origin substitution, things like this. But for smaller manufacturers, it's still quite some way away to making these kinds of forecasting decisions. So I think it's still all to be seen.
Okay, any last questions at this point? If not, I will just make sure that the panel doesn't have any last thoughts for for our audience at the stage. No, everyone's there. So I think we can thank the panel for taking us through what is a complex set of issues, but only one part of a wider field of customs procedures that we're going to have to learn a lot about over the next 2 to 3 years if, as seems likely, but heaven knows so much has changed in the last year that maybe we won't go this route, but we'll see. So let's say thank you to the panel.